And I think we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another NIDA in Conversation. My name is Bridie McKim, and joining me today is Anthea Williams. Thank you for being with us today, Anthea.
Thanks for having me, Bridie.
Amazing. Now, I just wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land in which I'm on today, here in Brisbane, the Yugara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and First Nations people joining us today. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And Anthea, would you like to acknowledge where you are at the moment?
Absolutely. Kia ora. I'm actually in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm in Christchurch at the moment. So that is the land of the Ngā Tahu. And it's lovely to be here. I just by chance managed to escape lockdown in Sydney.
Incredible. And for those people who are vision impaired who are joining us today, in my little Zoom icon, I have blonde hair and a white shirt and with a white background. And Anthea, yourself?
I am in a black jumper with a cream and black scarf on. I have dark brown hair and pale skin, and I have this pretty amazing wallpaper behind me that's got green leaves and avocados on it.
Yes, it is a piece of art, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Incredible. So Anthea, thank you so much for being here today. For those who aren't aware, Anthea is a pretty incredible theatre and now film director. Anthea has won Best Cabaret, Best Mainstage Production, and Best Director at the Sydney Theatre Awards. She's worked at Belvoir, both as a director and as a literary manager, and then as an associate director of new work. And Anthea has also made an incredible short film called Safety Net, which premiered at the Sydney Film Festival and was shortlisted for Best Short Award at the Whanumārama, the New Zealand
Whanumārama.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Say it one more time for the people in the
Whanumārama.
Incredible. We got it. International Film Festival, and it's had its North American premiere at Slamdance in 2021. Incredible. What a list of achievements already. That's amazing, Anthea. So you first, I'll just hype you over here in the corner, don't worry. So you first started out your career within theatre. And I'm always really curious to know, and I know this is quite a daggy question, but like, what made you want to go into theatre? And I'm also really interested in, like, when was the moment where you knew you could, like, be a theatre practitioner? Because even though we're in the echo chamber of the arts and we assume everyone works in the arts, it's still quite a niche career and life for us to have.
Yeah, I was a pretty determined young woman. And I think when I started university, I didn't apply to go to drama school. I went to university straight from high school, and that's also when I moved to Australia originally. I went to the University of New South Wales. But I didn't apply to Toi Whakaari, which is the New Zealand Drama School, or NIDA, because I knew that I didn't want to be an actor, but I did know that I wanted to work in theatre. And I think, you know, it's a thing we talk about a lot. You can only be what you can see. And at that time in New Zealand, all the directors I knew were kind of old men, old white men. Yeah. And so it was actually when I went to university and started working in student theatre that I realised that I actually wanted to be a director. And I actually did a production with a director who wasn't particularly good. And I was like, oh, this is all meant to be happening a different way. And I quite quickly realised I didn't want to be an actor, which was the hunch that I had, but I kind of felt like that was what young women did in the theatre. And I realised I wanted to be writing and I wanted to be directing. And so from when I was about 19, I worked in theatre while I was studying theatre and film. And I was a big part of the Nuts Society on campus.
I love the Nuts Society. They're great. They're so passionate. They're still going strong, I think. Yeah.
I know. So I was the vice president of Nuts while I was at university. Yay. And I directed a beautiful play called Me and My Friend by Gillian Plowman, and a few other works there, and some works that I written myself. And I just really enjoyed that time. And I've got to say, UNSW was pretty amazing. I actually went back there recently and directed a show at the Creative Practice Labs. I directed an Alice Birch play called Revolt. She said, Revolt Again. Basically, I'd been a student doing that course half a lifetime ago, and now I was back there running that course, and that was really exciting. But I guess for me, why theatre, why storytelling? It's always been a political act for me.
Okay.
It's always been about representation, about how do you make the world a better place, about how do you share stories, how do you hold a mirror up to society and also create the change that you want to change. And my way of doing that is storytelling. And I think that's also why I've always focused on new work. So I've always wanted to look at contemporary society and voices of people now, particularly people in minorities and women. So I've always wanted to privilege that. And that was partly why I was also really interested in new work development and being a literary manager, because for me, I'd far prefer to direct a couple of shows a year that I completely believe in than direct a whole raft of work. And I don't know, I've never had a huge desire to be a director of classics. I've always said, eventually I'll direct some, but I want to support living writers.
Fair enough. That's fascinating. I wonder, because you say that you got involved with the theatre because of its what you believe and what I believe is its inherent political nature. But we see a lot of people now with the discussions we're having now within our industry and within a lot of industries, saying that sometimes entertainment should just be entertainment for entertainment's sake. We need to take all the political notions and ideas out of it and just enjoy it for what it is. What do you think when people have that type of argument in a way that often serves to kind of dismiss people's political response? Or
I think it's impossible. I don't think you can take the politics out of representation and storytelling. It's just about what stories you intend to tell. Having said that, I think my work is really entertaining.
Of course.
And funny, and that's what the best theatre is. It'll make you laugh and make you cry, and hopefully both at the same time. So I think about something like Hair that I did at Belvoir, which is incredibly funny, but it's also incredibly political. So I guess I just don't think there's a distinction between what is entertainment and what is political storytelling. I think when people say just take all the politics out and make it entertaining, you can't take the politics out unless you're just kind of making it whatever you believe the status quo is, and that is only ever going to be one version of what is right and what the status quo is. So it's just not a thing, Bridie. I don't think it's a thing.
Yeah, I agree with you. That is so true. So you worked within theatre for a number of years and was quite successful within that. And then last year, because we actually met for the first time last year through the ABC, shooting a program called Reframe for National Day for People with Disabilities, because we both identify as being disabled. And you directed your film called Safety Net, starring a boy with a disability. Can you explain to us what that film is and how you really got into it?
So anyone who wants to see it who's based in Australia can see it on iView, because
we love iView.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? So if you just put Safety Net into iView, you can see it. The piece was written by Julian Lanark, and Julian is an amazing writer who I'd worked with at the National Theatre of Parramatta, and I read most of what Julian writes. He sent me this short piece, and he'd written it actually about 18 months earlier, and it was pretty much first draft, and I fell in love with it. He knew I was looking for a short film, and he'd actually written a piece about a young boy spending 24 hours in care with 2 different carers under the child welfare system after his mother has been arrested. he got the idea because he had a friend who was a primary school teacher, and she had been asked if she was willing to adopt one of the boys in her class, because this boy was suddenly going to be put in the foster system. So when I read it, I just really felt like the main character of Terry should be a young boy with a disability, because I really related to him. And I related to him because he used language to keep himself safe. He used humour to keep himself safe, and he was irreverent. But there was also this moment that Julian had written in the piece where the boy got up on the bed and started jumping, even though that was quite a painful and difficult process for him. And that is exactly what I did after my first ankle surgery when I was 6 years old. I woke up from it, got up on the hospital bed and jumped. Because when you're young and you're in spaces that are run by adults and are institutional and you don't have any control over them, you need to figure out how to make them yours. So I said to Julian, I want to change this. I want to make this a young boy with a disability. And Julian went with it. We got screenability funding from Screen New South Wales.
Amazing.
And we cast an amazing young man called William Best, who is a remarkable actor with some remarkable parents who are incredibly supportive. And we had a really amazing time working on the film together. And I think the film has done so well because it's a very real story, and you can't kind of replicate authenticity. So everything in the piece, even the fact that on set everyone was looking after a young boy who was living with cerebral palsy while doing his first film, that created this whole air of care around this child, which in some ways is what the film is about as well.
Mm-hmm.
It was a beautiful experience. And Julian, Naomi, the producer, and I are currently developing a feature version of the story.
Yeah, that's so exciting.
Yeah,
that's incredible.
It really is.
So I'm interested in knowing or hearing from you when we talk about authentic casting and how important it is. A lot of people bring up their concern that if you authentically cast a specific character, you may end up having to cast a person who has less experience or isn't trained, and that might inhibit the role in a way or be a disadvantage, and it might take away the job from another actor. Can you tell me the perks of casting Will and how he performed and how it went for the film?
I think that voice is really loud. I certainly had, not my producer and not Screen New South Wales, but I certainly had some people say, why don't you get an actor who's more experienced?
Yeah.
If I was casting a 12-year-old boy to do a short film with a first-time film director, I just thought, if you can't get your first experience when you're 12, when on earth can you get it?
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have been the same film without Will in it. I just think he was remarkable. There's a couple of issues, often we sell not only film but also theatre based on who is in it, and that becomes really difficult. It's far easier to get something made if you've cast Brad Pitt than if you've cast an unknown actor who lives with a disability.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's really tricky. Why should you cast someone with a disability? Because there are some things you can't act. You can create a good performance, but you can't actually have the knowledge of what that life is. And the repercussions of having someone with a disability in your team make everyone aware of that. Disability is it's not something you can turn off when the director yells cut.
Yeah.
I just think it brings a life to the work in so many ways. And you might end up having someone who's less experienced. You might end up having someone who doesn't have the same credits, but it's going to bring life to your work in other ways. And the other thing is, how can you ever get experience if you can't even be cast as what you are. If you can't even be cast as a 12-year-old boy, cerebral palsy, how are you ever going to get the next work? And, I don't just think this in the disability space. When I was doing here at Belvoir, the company supported me to make sure that we cast a young trans person in the role, and the show was much better because of that. Now, Kurt has since gone to VCA and is about to do a show at the Malthouse, which is awesome. But that was Kurt's first professional show at the time, and Kurt was remarkable in that role. But we not only brought Kurt into that production, we also had an assistant director who was a trans guy. We had an observer who was a young writer who was also trans. And it was just really important to bring that authenticity into the room, because how can you actually represent something if you don't know what it is?
Of course, yeah. I personally think it's quite a powerful asset to have on a team within a creative space.
Yeah.
You mentioned that, of course, you directed Hair and then you went on to direct Safety Net, this film. What do you think are the really useful tools that you developed within theatre making that you actually use quite a lot within filmmaking?
Well, one thing I was really surprised by was when I had my first meetings in film about how confident funders were around my ability to get performance. It takes so long to get a film up. Whereas I am in rehearsal rooms with actors months of the year. So those skills were such a great asset. And I just had so many tools at my disposal, both to work with new actors and really experienced ones. I think the other thing is, even though it takes a different type of visual sense in theatre to film, it's still a visual sense. Like, I'm still blocking a scene and then having the camera in it as well. It was just not a concern to me at all. I could do that really quickly. And I think I could also do it in a way that was really holistic for the actors.
Right.
And I was really comfortable with making change. I was really lucky when I directed my first film, because Rob Connolly, who directed The Dry, mentored me.
Wow.
And he was great. He was in Melbourne, so it's all via the phone. But before he produced The Boys, he actually worked in theatre as well. So he was just so great at saying to me, you already have all the skills that you need. Don't think that you don't. And he was also like, when things are alive in a rehearsal room, that's what you need to be looking for. And he was just like, don't be afraid to change things, which was all really good advice. And of course, the other thing I do a lot of in film is I do a lot of script development work. And, a lot of the same things apply. Character, structure, story, the nature of how a plot works. So that stuff is great. And the other thing that you can't forget is it's the same audience. You're still working for people. You're not making films for other theatre makers, just as you're not making theatre for other theatre makers. So you're still telling a story to the general public, who are brilliant and diverse.
Yeah, amazing. And I think it really shows within the film itself. Yeah, it's great. You mentioned before that you're working on the feature version of Safety Net. For what you can tell me, can you talk a little bit about the process and what that's like and how you're finding it?
Really long. It's a really long process. So we've had a little bit of funding from Screen New South Wales to start developing the treatment. In some ways, film has a great understanding of how much work goes into development, because you can get quite a bit of funding in small lots through the process for writing each draft. We are expanding the story to be about 4 days. So it's about trying to find this young man a permanent foster situation, so he doesn't have to go into a group home. And with the funding with Screen New South Wales, Julian and I went through a huge research process. So we spoke to young people in care and people who'd left care, people who set up child protection services, both in Australia and overseas, judges, lawyers, social workers. And that was a remarkable process to go through.
Yeah, of course.
And then, of course, we just spent time figuring out what the story would be, what the heart of it was, and writing a treatment, figuring out all that stuff. And so now we're looking for funding to write the first draft, but it's not a fast process.
Yeah, people are always shocked by how long those processes are. It's definitely a labor of love.
Yeah. And, I used to give out commissions at Belvoir, and when you get the commission, you get the money to write the script, including the drafts, whereas in film, it's far more segmented.
Yeah, it's a fascinating process. I'm going to have a little bit of a fangirl moment, because I really was first exposed to who you are and your work and your incredible thoughts and ideas when I was lucky enough to see the production of Beware of Pity in 2019 for the Sydney Theatre Festival. And you yourself saw it too. And then you wrote an article in response to that theatre show. And I just have a particular quote from the article. I know this is like very daggy, because just for a little bit of a recap, the show itself was an incredibly well done show, but it is centered around a story about I'll let you talk about this more, but about a woman with a disability and the people in her life responding to her and her disability. And you wrote an article within the Guardian as a response to that. And you said Edith, who was this disabled character, was upholding the cardinal rule for characters with disability in drama. They must be wretched, sometimes pathetic, and at best inspirational, and rarely objects of desire. Their presence is only to serve as a protagonist's journey, and either to recover or die. That quote really hit home for me, because I'm very used to seeing that type of portrayal of disability on our stages and screens. Could you please talk a little bit about the show itself, how you found it, and the article, and how all of this came about for you?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is I was really excited to see the work. It was Complicité and the Charbonnet. I'd been to Berlin a couple of times and always made sure I went to that theatre. I thought their work was remarkable. There were a couple of characters in the show who were all women, and women who lived with disability. And it seemed that there was no one working on the show who lived with disability. I did contact, not only me, but also the Guardian, contacted both Complicité and the Charbonnet to ask, and we never got a response. But in some ways it doesn't matter. Within the world of the work, you saw people running around the stage and then getting into a wheelchair. So it looked like people who lived without disability playing disabled characters. The disabled characters in that show were all pathetic, and they didn't have lives, and I found it heartbreaking. In some ways, I found writing that article terrifying, because I don't really make work about myself, and I'm a director, I'm not an actor, and people who'd worked with me knew that I had a disability, but I had never talked about it publicly. And so it felt like my version of coming out. And a lot of people with disability try to pass for not having disability because they don't want the issues that will happen in their career, the well-documented issues that will happen in their career if they do come out. Particularly in Australia, where representation is so woeful. About 3% of the characters we see on our TVs are people with disability, even though 20 to 25% of the population live with disability. Yeah. And the stories we're shown are so limited. And actually the thing is, representation matters, because generally it is people who are not living with disability who structure our society. And if they think that the lives of people with disability are limited and small and wretched, then they don't think that we need to have structures in place to help us work, have social lives, thrive. Just before I wrote that article, I'd done a Churchill Fellowship, and the hardest thing about doing my Churchill Fellowship was getting enough medication to go travelling with, because I'm on restricted meds that are expensive, and you have to apply for them every 6 months. And of course, there was no thought that maybe someone who would be doing that might go travelling for their career for 3 months.
Yeah.
And I really think that really limited representation we see of people with disability is part of the reason for that. I often refer to it as paying the disability tax, you know, those things. Like, I recently had to stay in New Zealand for longer. And again, the trickiest thing about it was figuring out how to get enough medication, because we deal with a health system that is all about acute illness when 25% of us have a chronic illness. So, yeah, it was a pretty scary article to write, but I have to say Wesley Enoch is amazing. He really is someone who understands that the arts are about making sure that we have these conversations in our society. And he was actually really thankful that I wrote the article that I wrote, which I thought was such a generous response, because he's absolutely, you know, that's absolutely why we put on the arts. But he could have been, he could have tried to shut down the conversation, and he didn't. Or he could have tried to tell me I was in the wrong, and he didn't. He was so gracious. Yeah, but I think the thing is, you know, Beware of Pity could have told that story, but it could have told it using actors who had disability. And it would have allowed for this whole other life within the work of, yes, this main character who has this very limited view about this woman, but she's actually so much more, because of course she was so much more. Because I think my disability is kind of the least interesting thing about me. There's so much else going on in my life, and I'm sure you feel the same, Bridie.
Yeah, for sure. I think most disabled people would say that about themselves. I find this topic so fascinating because when it comes to representation, the tides have changed a lot, and we're getting a lot of incredible representation of diverse minorities, like people of color, people from the LGBTQI+ community, and the list goes on. But I do get a sense that when it comes to disability representation, the passion isn't there yet within our industry. The drive and the thirst and the need for it isn't there within our industry quite yet. There are steps, important steps, but why do you think that when we talk about representation and diversity, disability doesn't always end up on the list of important representation?
Yeah, it really doesn't, does it? And if it does, it's always the last on the list.
The very last.
And, you know, if there's the night for, you know, I can get into theatre. I don't have particular access needs in that way. But, you know, it's always the Tuesday night with the Sunday afternoon. It's never Friday night at 8 o'clock. Why is that? I think we are, of all the minority groups, we're the most diverse. It's also a club that a lot of people don't want to join. You know, like if some people who have disability talk about the, I certainly talk about it as well, the social model of disability, which is that you are disabled by your society. And I think that is absolutely the case. But also with my rheumatoid arthritis, I'm in a lot of pain, and I've just come from another physio session to try to get my neck to move. And if I could get rid of my arthritis, I would do it in a second, because it is painful and time consuming and expensive. Mm-hmm. However, you know, there are a lot of people who live with disability that absolutely don't want to get rid of their disability, the thing that is seen as a disability, because it's fabulous and it makes them unique, and they might not live with regular pain, and that's fantastic as well. But, you know, I think in general, it is a minority that a lot of people don't necessarily want to be part of, which is really tricky. And, you know, like, It's only now that we really are beginning to invest in disability culture.
Yeah.
Or that I'm really beginning to invest in disability culture. It's certainly been around for longer. But, you know, some of us come from families where we're the only person who live with a disability.
Yeah.
And some of us have disability from birth. Some of us acquire disabilities later in life. I think it's, and we're also just so diverse into what those disabilities are. So I don't know. I think it's a really difficult one.
It is such a difficult and nuanced conversation. And as you say, the disability community itself is one of the diverse communities within itself. And that can make these kind of conversations really fascinating and quite complex. Yeah, I'm curious to know, what do you think the steps we need to take to really get this conversation going, but then again, in like changing the tide and making disability representation a part of the norm, and allowing people to really want to see disabled people within our creative teams and on stage and behind the camera and all that. What steps do you think we need to take?
Well, I think partly it's about representation. It's about just making it the norm.
Yeah.
Like one of my favourite things I've seen you in recently was Bump, where you just played a brilliant, fabulous, dorky high school student like everyone else in that production. You know, I love that. I thought that was great. And your character was delightful.
Thank you.
I think, you know, it is partly about that just ongoing visibility. I think it's also about people being aware of the numbers. Like, I think so often people are surprised when they find out that I identify as living with a disability. But I do. I think also there needs to be an understanding that we can tell stories with characters that live with disabilities that don't have to be about that.
Yeah.
You know, and certainly in terms of the work I've directed, I actually haven't made that much work about characters who live with disability, because that's not the only story I can tell. I probably have a greater understanding of what it is to be a minority than some directors, but you know, I generally make work that's about the lives of the writers and performers that I work with. But we've got to get rid of some of the terrible old stories. Like, we never need another film like You Before Me ever again.
I concur.
You know, no more films about a hot person with a disability dying so that their girlfriend can figure out who she is as a person. Yeah,
for sure.
No more getting cured, because that's the only way you can live a sustainable, happy life.
Yeah, I find it fascinating how backwards a lot of the dominant rhetoric around disability is within our cultural sphere, and and how shocked people are when you point out how backwards it is. And a lot of people love those films because the parts of those films are great, I guess.
Yeah, I remember thinking Dying Young was beautiful when I saw it,
I
don't know, years and years ago. We have these tropes again and again and again. It's only when someone else points out that's really not okay that you realise it. But at least we're beginning to have those conversations in our society now.
Yeah. I do just want to quickly say to anyone who's joining us live on Zoom or Facebook that if you want to ask Anthea a question, please send it in, and I will make sure that your question is put to her if possible. This conversation around disability representation is really fascinating, and I think is so important to a lot more people than people assume it would, because almost 20% of our population is disabled or identifies as having some sort of disability. And when you think of the number of people and how that aligns, as you mentioned, to the lack of representation we have, it is really quite incredible when you think about those numbers. So it's fascinating. So Anthea, what's next for you? What's on the cards? What is coming up?
Well, apart from working on the feature, I do quite a bit of development of screenwriting. So I've been spending a bit of time in writers' rooms recently, and I'm a script consultant on a feature that Screen Australia is currently developing. But I'm also working in theatre, which I adore. So at the moment, I'm working with Karen Therese on a piece that is about intergenerational trauma. It's a piece about her grandmother, her mother, and her sister, and it's about forgotten Australians. So we've been developing that for a couple of years, but we just found out this week that both Carriage Works and Riverside Theatres want it for next year. So that's really exciting. And I'm really looking forward to directing that piece. We've got a bit more development to do, but it's a beautiful work with a lot of film footage in it, both from Karen, film footage that Karen made, almost 2 decades ago, to film footage we've made this year.
Right.
And I'm about to also direct a show at NIDA. So I'm directing Love and Information by Carol Churchill.
Love that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to that. So I'm doing a graduate show this year. Those are the big things that I'm working on at the moment.
Yeah. So what really drew you to the show that you're working on in regards to intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, it's interesting. I often seem to be the director that gets a call when people are making the work that is about their own life.
Interesting.
It seems to have happened a lot. Omar Musa's Cabaret since Ali died. Nikia Louise play Kill the Messenger. Karen hasn't been on stage for, apart from she jumped into, it begins with T and I've forgotten the name of it. That's terrible. Tribunal. Jumped into Tribunal. But, she mainly directs, but she wanted to make a show about her family history. And Nikia, similarly, when we did Kill the Messenger, wanted to make a show about the history of her grandmother. I think I'm really interested in creating dramaturgies that allow actors to be safe on stage while they tell really traumatic stories, particularly without denying that trauma. That's particularly what I've been working on with Karen, because it's an unresolved story, and how do you create that work while not constantly re-traumatizing the people in it?
Pretty important.
Yeah, it's really important. I work a little bit at drama schools, and I always start off by talking about, how do you de-roll? In this case, there's no de-rolling. This is actually your life. So how do we keep you safe while you're on stage? And I'm also interested in finding a way through those stories so you can articulate that experience, but also look at it on a more global scale or a state scale where you're also looking at Australian history, because a lot of my work is about how you can't escape history. You can't deny what has happened in the past, and you need to address that. But it's been remarkable working with Karen on this work. We've been working on it for a couple of years, and we've become really good friends while we've been working on it. Amazing. It's really exciting that it's going to get a full season at some point next year. Well, funding dependent, it's going to get a full season some next year. Of course,
as always. That's incredible. I did want to ask you, and this might be a bit of a cliched question, but do you have advice to people who are up and coming directors, are from backgrounds that probably make them feel like they don't have a place in the industry, or any particular tools that you've found fundamental to your work and your practice?
I think sometimes, maybe not so much in the last decade, but sometimes in Australia with directors, we've really had a tendency to kind of throw people in hard and fast when they're young. And certainly when I was in my early 20s in Australia, and no one seemed to be employing female directors at all, I was really frustrated. I was so frustrated I moved to the United Kingdom.
That'll do it.
That'll do it. But I guess, in some ways I think learn about your craft as broadly as you can. I'm really pleased that while I was running around nuts, I stage managed and I lighting designed and I did sound design. I'm pleased that I have an understanding of all of that work. I think go and see a lot of theatre. I used to employ all of the assistant directors at the Bush in London where I worked. And I was amazed by how many times I would get calls from people who wanted to be an assistant director at a company but hadn't necessarily seen a lot of our work.
Yeah, wow.
And of course, in London there's hundreds of theatre companies. That's easy to do, but actually, you've got to invest in the companies that you want to be involved in. So I think see a lot, read a lot.
What should people be reading? Plays themselves? Or
yeah, go and see a lot of plays, go and see a lot of theatre, go and see a lot of independent film, go to the Sydney Film Festival, think about storytelling in really broad terms. In terms of coming from a minority group, own it. Own the stories that you have a unique perspective on because of the particular group that you come from. But don't, at the same time, don't feel limited by that. Like, I think it's really important that much as storytelling needs to be authentic, we also need to collaborate because we live in a society where we all work together as well.
yes.
So, yeah. I think those would be big pieces of advice. I don't think we're in a situation where young women who want to be directors need to move to the other side of the planet anymore, and that's really great. But we have to keep on fighting for those opportunities because we've certainly had waves in Australia where things have got more progressive and then they have become very white and very male again, and then they've become more progressive and become very white and very male again. So we need to keep on making sure we fight for that diversity.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, it's so integral.
Yeah.
And if there's any actors joining us, you mentioned before the importance of de-rolling, and you feel that within the situations where you teach and work.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to the concept of de-rolling or any other important notes or thoughts you have for actors?
Yeah. Okay, so I'll talk about de-rolling first. I always say to an actor, you can't run a marathon and then tell your body it was a pretend marathon. It doesn't.
That's a good way of putting it. Good.
Yeah, yes. Your body just doesn't work like that, and your mind and your brain are connected. And I'm not saying acting as though you have just lost a child or watched your partner be killed is the same as having that experience, but your body and your brain constantly talk to each other, and you put yourself through that, it does take a toll. And so you have to figure out how to complete that stress cycle. So whether that is about going home and putting on some of your favorite music and dancing for 20 minutes, or going for a walk, or just actually doing something else and giving yourself the time to take your brain to a new place is really, really important. And red wine is not the way to do it. That actually won't work. No, like much as it's great having a glass of wine on a Friday after rehearsals with the actors, and that's important to do. And you can get away, like I always talk about this with students, because you can get away with that in your 20s, but by the time you get older, it can take a real toll on your body. Yeah. So it's actually about actively figuring out what your brain and your heart and your body needs to take you into a new place, and not telling yourself that you're stupid for feeling a bit sad. I remember watching a very dear friend who I hadn't seen for a couple of years. I went to visit her, and she'd just done a guestie on a TV show, and she'd been crying all day. And it was so lovely to see her, and she was so happy to see me, but she had big puffy eyes, and she looked physically exhausted, like someone would if they'd been crying all day, because she'd been crying all day. So it's about figuring out what that journey is for you, and giving yourself time to practice that safety.
It's so important that people feel like that they can go after what they feel like they need to do to look after themselves, and giving themselves permission to do that and to listen to their body. I think it's so important.
Yeah, and not kind of judge themselves for dealing with the repercussions of what's in their craft. Because if they were sports people, we wouldn't be surprised that they needed to go to physio or drink some electrolytes. So why do we think that actors can just come off stage and let it all go?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And for actors who may, like, if their dream would be to work on one of your shows or to work within one of your films, do you have any tips on what they should be focusing on, or what they may need to do to be put in a position to work with someone as incredible as you?
That's a hard question to answer in front of those terms. Okay, so it's really interesting, isn't it? I think with actors, the actors who have the most interesting careers are often people who are self-starters. So they're people who get into writing or making as well. They're people who read and allow themselves to become collaborators in multiple ways. And they're people who end up with quite broad careers. I think they're often the happiest and most empowered people who work as performers within the industry. Because of course, everyone just wants that director who they want to work with to call them and say, I want you to play Cleopatra for me. But, that director might not get to direct Cleopatra anytime soon. And, I've auditioned a lot of people. I always try to audition quite broadly if I've got a role that I can audition for. And so often it is the case that you see people who are completely wrong for a role who are completely brilliant performers. And I've certainly had ideas for other shows that I've wanted to direct because of that. So I think don't get disheartened if you audition for one of your favourite directors and then they don't cast you in it. It might just be that you're not right for their vision for that particular work. But I think it's also really good when you go and see people's work. It's so lovely when you occasionally get those emails from people that say, hey, I saw this and I really liked it for these specific reasons. And having said that, there are a lot of actors who I really admire, who I would be absolutely thrilled to work with, who I haven't been able to work with because I just haven't had the right role to give them.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and so many of those things are outside of both your control and the actor's control. So we have a question from Facebook. Thank you. So Anthea, looking ahead to Love and Information, how do you plan to tackle such a unrestricted and open form as set by Carol Churchill?
Oh gosh, I don't know yet.
I found out.
Well, look, that's such a cheeky answer. That's exactly what I'm going to say on the first day of rehearsals as well. Sam Menzies, who is a director who's now mainly known for Bond films, but he used to run the Donmar Warehouse. When he was asked what the difference between theatre and film was, he said, in theatre, when you say, I don't know, everything opens up. And in film, when you say, I don't know, everything shuts down. And that is quite true. On a film set, you always have to be like, you need to set up over there right now, even if you're figuring out something else. Look, I think it's going to be a great show to do with native third years because it's going to give me a chance to work with them not only as actors but also as collaborators and devisers. There are some amazing scenes in that piece that could be done in so many different ways. And I think I will make a show that's really based around those particular performers and our collective vision for the work. I certainly know that there are going to be some elements, some like visual elements in the work. I'm sorry, by that I mean like some film elements in the work.
Yeah, great.
But I haven't met my cast yet, and they will inspire me a great deal. I think it's a remarkable play. It's a play that I've wanted to make for a long time. And I'm also just really interested in how you bring a lot of love into it, you know. I think people get really tied up on the information part of Love and Information.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of people trying to connect or failing to connect in that work. And that's the stuff I'm really interested in as well. Yeah, and I think it's also really interesting to see, you know, what happens. Sydney's seen a production of Love and Information that Kip did about 8 years ago.
Yeah.
But actually our relationship to information and the media has evolved even more than greatly in the last 8 years. It might have even been 10 years ago that he did that production. So there's so much more information to bring onto it now. You know, I even remember when I did Kill All Men at Night. We were talking about
great show. That was in my time. I enjoyed that one.
Were you in second year that when I did that?
I was, and I was like, "This is amazing! There's fake blood going everywhere."
Yeah, that was the first show I did at NIDA, and I just adored it. Nakia Louie wrote that piece, and gosh, we had a brilliant time making that show.
Yeah.
But you know, we brought a couple of phones that could do video on, and now I'm like, I just carry something like that around in my pocket all the time.
Yeah.
So it'll be fun to see what we can do.
Yeah, great. So much fun. And so for my last question to you, Anthea, if anyone else wants to follow both your work and also some of your amazing ideas, you've also got a podcast that people can go and access. Do you want to tell me a little bit about that in case somebody wants to go and track you down?
Yeah, so the podcast is called Activated Arts, and it's available through Spotify and Apple Podcasts, Google, you know, all the major places. It's also supported by 2RPH Radio in Sydney, so it's every second Friday, 2:30 in the afternoon. We make a show every 4 weeks, and basically what we are making work about is artists with disabilities, so it's cross-artful. I think, you know, at first people thought we were going to talk about access in terms of, you know, making sure that people in wheelchairs could get into the theatre. And that's really, really, really important. And people need to think more about sightlines. But I'm so much more interested in talking to people who make theatre and art and television and music who live with disabilities. And I think what's lovely about the show is it's just artist to artist. So it's, I kind of rabbit on as much as everyone else, as Bridie knows, because Bridie came on it once. And it's it's just a conversation between artists about work, about their work, about particular issues that they're facing at the moment. Bridie came on the podcast. We talked about Sia's film music. And we also spoke with Sophie Smythe, who is an actress who has autism, who is on the autism spectrum disorder spectrum. I said that badly. She has autism.
Yes.
And we talked about the casting of that film and the nature of that film. And it was just lovely to talk to two brilliant, intelligent actresses about their reactions to that film. But one of my favourite ones is the piece we did recently, Comedy and Disability, because, of course, people with disability are just genuinely inherently funnier.
Oh, yes. Can confirm.
Exactly. So I just kind of spent my whole time giggling through that. But it's a fun podcast. We'll have another one coming out in 2 weeks' time, but the one that's currently on is the one for Screenability, where I talk to a lot of the filmmakers who've made films under the Screenability program like I have.
Incredible. Yeah, and that's an amazing piece of funding that people should definitely investigate if they're a person with a disability who wants to create short films. So people can access that on Spotify, is that correct?
Spotify, basically anywhere you get your podcasts, you could just type in Activated Arts. I get it through my phone, the app that Apple gives you, but it's also on Google Podcasts. It's also on Oh, look, the Alexa version, whatever that is, it's on
all
all the
the
major
versions.
ones.
Yeah,
All
great.
the versions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And as you said, people can go and view your amazing short film Safety Net on iView.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anthea, I think that is all we have time for, I guess. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's been incredible to talk to you. I've been an admirer of yours for so long, and thank you. And thank you to both of our Auslan interpreters for joining us today, and for anyone else who has been watching live or will watch a bit later. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Bridie. Thanks for having me.
Enjoy New Zealand.
I will do. Kia ora.